Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on the History Valley podcast. And today I'm live with Dr. Chris Cornthwaite. And today we're going to be talking about his thesis, a goddess in the caravans and the savior in the holes, worship and migration Athens, Delos, and Corinth. And for those that are unfamiliar with Chris, Chris Cornthwaite holds a PhD in Christian origins with the Department for the Study of Religion at the University of Toronto. His thesis studied religion and migration across ancient diasporas. He has published on early Christian social formation and Hellenistic Jewish diasporas and literature, with a strong emphasis on material culture, papyrology, and epigraphy. He worked on the commentary series on Greco-Roman associations. He currently works outside the academy, but his YouTube channel focuses on ancient and modern Christianity. I have his YouTube channel tagged in the description below, and the link to it will also be provided in the pinned comment. With that being said, Chris, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's a real honor. I've been a big fan of your channel. I would say it's probably my favorite channel on YouTube. I watch a lot of it, including a lot of your back episodes. I go back all the time and watch old stuff. So I really appreciate being here.
Oh, thank you very much. And I really want to make this point clear that I highly recommend my audience go check out Chris's channel and subscribe if they haven't already done so. He has a lot of great videos there, and he's done a lot of fascinating interviews with many scholars, some of which have been on this channel and others that have not been on the channel before. So check those videos out, everybody. So again, the title of his PhD thesis is A Goddess in the Caravans and a Savior in the Halls, Worship and Migration Athens, Delos, and Corinth. And that takes me to my first question. Who are the four ancient diasporas that you refer to in your thesis?
Yeah, good question. So when I came to doing my thesis, I wanted to do something comparative. I mean, I think I had read, like most people, the accounts of the spread of early Christianity, and it often looks something like what we read in the book of Acts. You get some kind of account for, Christians, something to do with the diaspora synagogues, maybe God-fearers are a part of that. These people who are kind of on the margins of synagogues, maybe Christianity goes out to them, and then it kind of spreads from there and takes off, and Gentiles come in. And I think that's been the model, I think, of Christian origins that has been pretty, I would say pretty predominant throughout most of the 20th century. And for me, one of the questions that I had going into my thesis as I formulated it, you need to write a research proposal when you do a thesis. And my question was, what other immigrant groups in antiquity spread like that? How can we study other groups and find out, like, is this comparable? Are there other groups that have something similar? Diaspora spreading religion, is that a thing? How does that work? So when I came in, I very naively thought I was going to take the book of Acts, which at the time I thought was a pretty accurate historical representation of how Christianity spread. I was just a aspiring master's student wanting to do my PhD. And as I moved toward doing the PhD, recognized that Acts had its own problems, which we can talk about later. But nevertheless, there was a couple of really big questions when you go to approach ancient diasporas. One of the big issues is just the matter of evidence. There just isn't really that much. And we certainly don't have that much that's like early Christianity and being this really heavy literate culture that we have a lot of different things we can draw on. So the question was, how do you even start to form a comparison? How do you find these other ancient diasporas and how do you begin to study them? So essentially, I would say the material that I chose to study is not perfect, and you'll see that as we go through it, because it's really hard to find things that are analogous to early Christianity that give us enough material to really kind of pull anything meaningful out of. So the case studies that I focused on, first of all was the goddess Bendis, who is a Thracian goddess who comes into Athens, probably sometime in the 5th century BC. And then the second two were both on a little island of Delos. So Delos is a Greek island in the Mediterranean, not too far from, Mykonos is the famous party island. Delos is actually just right across from it. So it's there, and the Romans made Delos a free port in the 2nd century BC, and it became it had a really century of flourishing. That a lot happened there, and within that context, there's two immigrant groups we can trace really nicely on Delos itself. One is a sanctuary of the Syrian goddess. The Syrian goddess is named Atargatis, but becomes known by the Greeks as the Syrian goddess, or the pure Aphrodite sometimes, or Dea Syria, as Lucian wrote. Lucian wrote a book, Dea Syria, or maybe it's not Lucian. We can talk about that. And then finally on Delos, it was a group of Phoenicians who worship Poseidon, but essentially Baal. So these were the groups that I could kind of piece together. Now, we don't have literary evidence. We have epigraphy, which is basically writings carved on stone. So it's certainly not the same type of evidence that we have for early Christianity. But looking through and trying to generate a social history essentially of these immigrant groups and the interrelation between their worship and how it evolved over time. And I think I was able to, with those comparisons, actually get some really interesting kind of questions to ask about early Christianity. And then that brings me to my fourth group, which was Corinth. So I studied, looked at Paul in Corinth. And I think, this thesis I wrote, now we're looking at 8 or 9 years ago. So it's, I'm a little rusty on it, first of all. So if there's anything I forget, people can fact check me in my own thesis if I get anything wrong in this interview. But I think at the time, I went and worked outside of the academy, but coming back and doing interviews with other people, other scholars, it's been interesting to come back and reflect on some of the other lessons. So those are the 4 case studies. They're not perfect, but they are the foundation of my research. And then the other thing, sorry, I'll stop there and let you ask another question.
That's all right. But well, for my next question, how does the diaspora theory treat religion?
Great question. That's what I was going to talk about anyway. So that's perfect. Yeah, I don't want to get too much into the theory. I don't know how much your viewers enjoy engaging with the theoretical versus the historical or whatever, but it is important. And obviously, a lot of people may know there was a trend in religious studies that happened over the 20th century to recognizing that the way that we study religion was very much kind of formulated out of, I would say, like a specifically Protestant Western kind of view that essentially tried to look at other world religions. Like the whole world religions model came from mapping other religions onto like what we think of when we think of religion. So often, just for example, say, well, we have gods, therefore, Hindus must, or sorry, we have a god, Hindus must have a god. We have a holy book, Muslims have a holy book. Like, so there was this attempt to map religion in that sort of comparative way. So a lot of the work in religious studies was really undoing a lot of that modern study, or somewhat modern study of religion and modernity, and trying to get us back to a way that we can study religion without it being kind of this preformed category. So the word religion is extremely problematic. And then famously, when we look at religion in antiquity, again, there's not really anything comparable to what we think of when we think about modern religion. And one of the most famous papers on this, I know you've had him on the channel, but Steve Mason talking about not using the word Jewish, but using the word Judeans in antiquity as a reference to the fact that Judeans really is an ethnos, and the Judean God goes with the ethnos of the Judeans. So there's a recognition that it's really difficult to talk about religion in antiquity as a set of, certainly as a set of beliefs, as a set of practices, as a shared orientation towards some kind of God. It's a lot more complicated than that. But then the other problem I found, because the other theory that I wanted to bring into use was the diaspora theory. And when I studied diaspora theory, it had its own kind of problems. It was really formed in the 20th century as well. And it was really predominantly driven by this kind of ideal of the Babylonian diaspora, this galut, like this idea of like weeping by the rivers of Babylon. And that worked its way through a lot of modern diaspora theory. And then the other thing about modern diaspora theory is it sort of became intricately tied to the idea of a state. And obviously, if you look at the modern Jewish diaspora, it's become, since the foundation of the state of Israel, it's become an other to a Jewish state. So that kind of modern nationalism as well, I think really, really played a lot through diaspora theory. So when you're trying to take these things back to antiquity, these categories just really don't work. Like trying to study religion and diaspora which I said in my research proposal, already you have two categories that don't really work for antiquity. So I was doing a lot of work with these Greco-Roman associations, which was this this model of studying ancient social groups. You've had John Kloppenborg on; he was my supervisor, so I was working with him on these kind of associations, and it provided a really good way to think about social formation in a way that wasn't like, these are immigrants, this is a religious group, this is a some kind of ethnic group. Like, there was a lot of interplay between identity, and that's what I could get out of my thesis. So the way that I approached this, when I approached these ancient social groups, these ancient groups that I'll talk about, these 4 case studies, was through a lens that I well, I didn't coin this. A sociologist, Charles Tilly, coined this, but the idea of networks of trust. That essentially, it's not really about looking at specific boundaries of identity that we might look at like in a modern sense or as modern people, but trying to look at what made up this trust network, as we call it, like who these people were, what drew them together, and how then, like, try to start from that, and then think less about the categories of religion or diaspora or things like that. And one of the fascinating things that really came out in all of my case studies, and I can talk about them individually, but there was a really interesting interplay between what we would consider religion and economy. That the 2 parts of like trade and the worship of gods and the movement of gods on the Mediterranean, you really can't separate that from the ancient economy and from the movement of ideas. The movement of gods also goes along with the movement of goods and the movement of materials, slaves, all of those sorts of things. So that became the way that I approached these ancient groups. So I will call them ancient immigrant groups. It's not a perfect title. But the other thing that was interesting to me is that in at least all but one of these case studies, so that's, I guess, 3 out of 4, we have groups moving beyond, well, in 2 in particular, we have groups that started as ethnic groups and came to be sort of mixed ethnic groups. So we also get this phenomenon of something that might have started as an ethnos-based religion. I'm going to use these words. I know they're problematic, but I've nodded at it, and I just need to keep going because otherwise it's impossible to talk about this stuff. We have these things start as ethnos-based groups, but then over time, other people come in. So that gave me a really interesting kind of analogy to early Christianity as well. When you see a group that seems like some kind of national god or goddess that then becomes worshipped by other people who do not belong to that ethnic group. So that's kind of the approach I took, and that's why the labels are problematic. But that's kind of the theoretical underpinning.
So I want to go back to Acts. You mentioned earlier about how you used to think that Acts was an accurate representation of the spreading of Christianity, when in reality it actually isn't. So could you get in? Could you take us in about some of the issues using Acts as history, and what does the evidence actually show about the spread of Christianity?
Yeah, I think when we look at Acts, we get a very, I like to use the word mythologized, and I don't mean that to say there's no kernel of truth in it. There could be, but you get this very, you essentially have literary aims. Whoever wrote Acts has literary aims. I know you've had Marcus Vincent on. I talked to Marcus recently on my channel too. He's also shaped my thinking a lot on Acts as well. But even before knowing Marcus and his ideas, I mean, you can kind of see these literary tropes of Paul goes into a town, goes to the synagogue. Synagogue says no, thank you. Rejects him, sometimes not so politely. He goes out often to the God-fearers, or sometimes just other people, and then finds converts outside of the synagogue. And I mean, it's easy to kind of look at that and say, well, maybe that's something that happened in ancient diasporas. But fundamentally, this is actually more about a literary goal that Luke, or I'm going to say Luke for the time being, but let's say Luke wants to accomplish with writing Acts, because Acts needs to explain why this movement moves out from being, a Jewish movement to a Gentile movement. So this provides a really nice kind of story, because, well, the Jews didn't want it, and they went to the synagogues, they said no, and then it went to the Gentiles. So the idea that this is a really good descriptor of the spread of Christianity, I think, is about as likely as thinking that, if you read the first few chapters of Acts, the idea that half of Jerusalem was basically converted within a few weeks of the Christian movement. I mean, I think this is a really heavily mythologized, stylized way of thinking about this. So what I ended up, and maybe if it's okay, I'll just hint at this now, because I think the case study, if I can talk through the case studies in a minute, I think it'll help to open up some of the questions about the spread of Christianity. But what I did end up arguing in my thesis, looking specifically at Corinth, was that I think in Corinth, it's more likely that what happened in Corinth began as a Gentile movement, created by Paul, and maybe, and I'm speculating from the data here that I can show in a little bit, but maybe having to do with like some kind of trade or economic network, after which it became a mixed group. So at some point, Judeans came in, and that's sort of what I think is going on in Corinth. And I could pull maybe if it's okay, like towards the end, I could talk about this. But when we see things like the weak and the strong in First Corinthians, I think what you actually have there are the Judeans are the strong ones, and the weak ones are the Gentile members there. So I think that's, yeah, I think it just doesn't really fit Acts. Like so many things, when you look at Paul's letters, you get a different story than what you actually get if you look at Acts as your history. So.
Yeah, one of those differences I've talked about many times is sometimes, like you see in Second Corinthians when it states that he went through 3 shipwrecks, but in Acts you just get 1. And if you're imagining Acts' history, what do you do with that? Do you add it? Like, okay, well, Acts was just talking about the 4th one, or Acts is talking about one of them. How do you harmonize that? And there are different ways that somebody, I suppose, could try to be clever and try to make it work.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much there. It's like you look at, I don't know, the idea that Paul studied under Gamaliel, that would be a really nice thing to pull out when he has these competitions with these, so-called super Jews in First Corinthians, but sorry, first or second, but he doesn't ever mention it. Yeah.
It's almost like you'd think that he would boast that in Philippians when he's stressing the Hebrew of Hebrews and the Benjamite connections.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, these are the things you'd expect to see, but they don't seem to come up. Yeah.
What do you make of the conflicting information between the letters and Acts regarding Paul's travels?
I mean, pretty much the same thing we've already alluded to, that I don't really know that the author of Acts knows all that much. I mean, presumably the author of Acts knows where Paul has been and where there are some ecclesias, where there are some churches. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to really get a sense that the author of Acts knows too much. There's interesting stuff. This is not my work, but I've seen other work, and I know John Kloppenborg's talked a bit about this. The idea of the geography that Acts knows, and where you get really really specific information about like the trade winds and things like this. So there's definitely somebody writing Acts who knows a little bit about travel in the Mediterranean. But yeah, in terms of whether that's an accurate depiction of Paul's travels, I don't know.
So when you look in the 2nd century and you go forward in the 3rd century and beyond to look at the spread of Christianity, and you look at Christian interaction with other cultures and other deities, what does the evidence reveal?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think maybe to answer that, I would go back, if that's okay. Do you mind if I go back kind of the 2nd century BC? Is that okay?
Sure.
Because I think some of these case studies all of the case studies I did are from before the spread of Christianity. But I think they are really interesting. And I'll walk you through an example, and maybe that'll help kind of think about how I'm thinking about this. So if we go to the island of Delos, we have this really interesting group of people who worship the Syrian goddess there. So the Syrian goddess, her name is Atargatis, and she's based, I'm going to talk about her like she's a real person. She's based in the city of Hierapolis. So Hierapolis is essentially quite close to the Euphrates on the other side of Syria. And in Antiquity, in the 2nd century BC, it's almost like the last stop before you get to the Parthian Empire. So you have these trade routes. Like there's no way of getting around that this goddess is spreading to Delos and eventually to Rome, specifically because of trade routes. Like there's absolutely no way around this. So what we get on Delos around like the year 166 BC, we have a priest and his wife who found a sanctuary for this Syrian goddess on Delos. And by sanctuary, I mean, it's probably pretty small to begin with. They get some land from the Serapion. So there's a really nice big site actually on Delos, a couple rooms or a couple buildings for the worship of Serapis. So they have some kind of land either on it or beside it, and they build a sanctuary of the Syrian goddess. And it seems like for about maybe 50 years, this sanctuary is the site of worship of the Syrian goddess, and it's primarily Hieropolitans. It's primarily Syrians who are worshiping this goddess, and we can kind of trace it. It's interesting. Like you see this family. There's a progression there, and with that, they bring in things that look not much like a Greek cult. Like they bring in things that look very I'm going to say Eastern. I don't like that word, but it looks like it's from Syria, and it's, has some resonances of what we see in Judean worship as well. So, for example, the priests and priestesses, like things happen. It says kataprostagma, which is like divine command. So they have this idea of the goddess telling them to do things, telling them to build a sanctuary, telling them to honor benefactors, this kind of stuff. They have this idea that the goddess hears their prayers. There's this really interesting kind of playover with this banqueting culture. So in Syria, you would have this there's this word in Aramaic, it's marzeach, which essentially is the same idea. If anybody knows like the Greek theasos, it's like a banqueting association. So this group is primarily a banqueting association. They're obviously probably holding these nice banquets, these nice parties on Delos. So they continue like that for quite a long time. What ended up happening, though, and it's really interesting, is they end up, so at some point, probably around 112 BC, Athens takes over all of the cults on Delos, takes over the leadership of the cults on Delos, and from then on, the priests are Athenian. And as we look at this sanctuary of the Syrian goddess, we can see it opening up and including other people who are not Syrian. So this is like other worshipers from around the Mediterranean. And as you look at the names, which I did, I kind of listed at this point all the names when I wrote my thesis to see who's in the sanctuary. I actually drew a network map, and they're from all over the place. Like people from all over the place are coming across the Mediterranean and worshiping in this sanctuary. So you get this like opening up of membership that's really interesting. And with the worship, even after the Athenian takeover, there remains some of these things that I think we could consider like Syrian. So there's like this candlestick base at one point that's it's called the word in Greek says they're dedicating a namara, which is essentially like the same as like menorah. I think we could say like this is a word from Aramaic that's being brought straight into Greek and kept in Aramaic and Greek. So you get these kind of words that move into Greek that's really interesting. So there are all these ways. I won't get too far down this rabbit hole, but there are all these ways that the cult kind of retains this sense of Syrian identity and language, even when it's taken over by the Athenians. But I want to point to this because I think this is the most important for thinking about God-fearers and thinking about wealthy people. So at the Syrian sanctuary, there are three dedications by like that really, really show, I think, how rich and influential some of the people at this sanctuary are. The first one is a priest named Zoilos. So Zoilos dedicates a fish pond. In the sanctuary of Atargatis, they worship sacred fish, or the sacred fish have something to do with their worship. So he dedicates this fish pond. And he dedicates this fish pond, and he says it's to the people of Athens, the people of Rome, and it's to his friend. His friend's name is Midas. Now, Midas, we actually know because he's been active in other inscriptions from different, like we see him in different sanctuary, different places on the island, donating things. And Midas turns around that same year, and in another inscription, Midas donates, like a courtyard. He donates the supplies for a roofed colonnade. He donates a house. He eventually donates a mosaic. He donates all of these buildings, all of this building stuff to the sanctuary of the Syrian goddess. So we have Zoilos sets up this fish pond in honor of his friend Midas, this rich guy. And this rich guy turns around that same year and dedicates like a whole bunch of building stuff at the Syrian sanctuary. Fine. In his inscription, this guy, Midas, the second guy, says, I'm going to dedicate all of this stuff to my friend Philostratus. You don't have to remember these names, I barely do, but my friend Philostratus. And Philostratus is a really wealthy banker on Delos. So Philostratus, we know from like other inscriptions, is just a really, really wealthy banker. So we have these three guys doing these dedications at the sanctuary of the Syrian goddess. And it's interesting as I think through, like, when we think about God-fearers, we think about wealthy, when we think about God-fearers, we think about people hanging out, in some proximity to a synagogue. And one of the things that struck me as I was thinking through this is when you look at Josephus is the first place you get this idea of a God-fearer, as far as I recall. You get the God-fearers in Acts famously. Look at how often these God-fearers are wealthy and connected people. And I saw the same thing when I looked at, we have the famous inscription from Aphrodisias, which talks about the God-fearers there. And they're wealthy donors of some sort. We can't even tell if they're attending this synagogue, but they're wealthy donors. So it's really interesting to me to look. It was really interesting to look at the sanctuary of Syrian goddess and to realize that fundamentally we have something there that looks very similar to God-fearers. We have something there that looks like these wealthy, connected people, wealthy, connected Romans, frankly, are using the sanctuary for benefaction. They're gifting things. They're calling each other out. They use this language of friendship that's really interesting. They say, I'm dedicating this to my friend. So we have this incredible kind of, in my mind, it's a really interesting parallel to what we'd often think of as God-fearers, because I don't think one of the things we realize enough is that God-fearers often seem to be wealthy. Even if you read Acts, God-fearers seem to be fairly well-connected individuals. And I think that's kind of maybe something parallel that we could see from this sanctuary. So this is just an example, but this is the kind of stuff that when you study these parallel stuff, there's nothing that perfectly lines up, but it starts to you kind of have these questions that come out, like, how does that line up? How does that relate? So that's just maybe one example. I'll stop there for a minute, but that's one example of how doing this kind of comparative stuff can open up some new avenues for discovery that maybe we haven't thought about before.
Could you expand on the more explicit links between the BC era and the spread of Christianity? And my second part to that question is, do you think that early Christians and maybe some Christians later were looking at some of this stuff from other movements and how they spread? Do you think there might have been some influence there? Were they reading some of these texts? Do we know anything about that?
That's an interesting question. I wonder. Yeah, I guess the first part is, I guess we just, like, one of the things about studying these is it's never a one-to-one relationship. When I'm looking at other immigrant groups, I wish there was something that we had this like rival religion to Christianity, that we had a full set of readings and we could kind of study their literature and see how they spread. It's just not really that simple. And of course, Christianity in itself is not that simple. It's not really one movement. It's multifarious streams and ideas and all of that sort of thing spreading. So I think that it's not so much, I don't get the sense when I think through this that it's Christians copying, but I think that it's often just the natural thing that happens when you have these social group formations. One of the fundamental social realities of the ancient world is euergetism. It's that associations, sanctuaries, and synagogues are no exception. They want the connections, they want the benefaction of well-connected, influential people, if for nothing else than like to pay the bills and build the buildings and do the stuff and from the Greek time, and this was true, I didn't talk about the sanctuary of Bendis yet, I can, but even from the sanctuary of Bendis, from like ancient Athens, like we have this idea that benefactors, wealthy benefactors, should be celebrated, should be encouraged. We have an inscription from Delos. One of my other case studies was a group of Phoenicians, and they have a benefactor who gives them like a ridiculous amount of money. And they do a whole bunch of things, but then they say one of the reasons that they do it, all these things to honor this benefactor, is that they want other people to imitate it. So I think it's important to see not so much that Christians were necessarily copying, I don't think, But I think there's just things that are social realities that we don't always see when we look through our modern, lenses. So, for example, when we think about piety, one of the things, if you know any of the history of the God-fearers, I don't know who you've had on to talk about God-fearers if you have, but a lot of the history of the God-fearers was often dominated by the question of, well, do they have to convert? What does conversion look like? Are they expected to be circumcised? Well, presumably they're not. So maybe, famous, like I'm going back a century now, but some of the earlier studies of the God-fearers would say, well, maybe they're they're Gentiles who couldn't handle the reality of the Jewish law. So they just kind of hung around the synagogue, but didn't actually convert. Maybe the circumcision is a big one. Maybe they followed food laws, or they were interested in the philosophy, or they liked the prayer, but they didn't, it's just kind of like these half Jewish converts essentially, that then provided a really nice way for people to explain the spread of Christianity, because essentially once you have these people who are like not quite Jewish, they provide this really nice story about these like kind of intermediary people that can really easily spread Christianity outward. The problem is, I think a lot of that is really a modern assessment. Now, it's not to say that God-fearers, I mean, if you look, there's a fair amount of evidence about God-fearers, and there's different elements to it. I'm focusing specifically on the wealthy God-fearers, which are quite common even in the book of Acts. So what happens when you think through this with this associative lens in mind, if you look at these comparable things, you realize like virtually every single sanctuary that we can see really prioritized relationships with wealthy and influential people. They loved these relationships. They wanted these. And when you think through this, you start to realize a lot of the things we assume must be wrong. So for example, if I think, well, if there's a God-fearer hanging onto a synagogue, I would think, okay, well, maybe I don't think this, but this is like what in the past is often people will think, well, okay, well, maybe the synagogue didn't allow them to be didn't need them to be circumcised, made an exception or something. Or so we try to come up with this idea of how they could be there without being subject to the Jewish law. But fundamentally, when you look at the comparable inscriptions, that's completely upside down. There's no way that God-fearers, you imagine these like wealthy people coming to try to give like the equivalent of millions of dollars to your group, and you're like, well, okay, but are you circumcised? Like, it's a total inversion of power that I think we often think about it when we're thinking about modern conversion. We're fundamentally thinking about conversion to a religion. And this comes back to the sort of problematic ways that we approach this evidence, and that we define, like we kind of map our modern definitions onto antiquity. So we think that piety, for example, means something like psychological, that you have good feelings, you have like maybe nice thoughts about God, or maybe you're praying or something. Like, piety could just mean giving a whole bunch of money. Like, couldn't that be a way of fearing God in antiquity, if we're like taking off these boundaries between what religion is? Giving a lot of money could be a religious act. And actually, if you look at Josephus, who talks about God-fearers, what do? They give a ton of money to Jerusalem. It's a similar thing you get in Acts. You get wealthy people there as well. So I think that when you do this comparative work, it's not that Christians were copying this stuff. It's just that I think often we misunderstand the world of early Christianity. And there's stuff that I've found, and I love this association work, not just like I've done this work, but there's a lot of people working on it as well. And one of the things I find, it's just often so revealing, because when you look at these comparables and you realize you often just see things you don't see otherwise. If you're looking at ecclesia and you realize these are city councils primarily, that changes the way you think about the spread of Christianity. Why would they use the word ecclesia? So I find that's one of the most interesting things about doing this kind of like expanding the evidence a little bit and trying to get out beyond just Jewish and Christian things, because most of us in my field tend to focus there and tend to like really narrow down and try to study harder and try to look for precedents in other Jewish communities or the Hebrew Bible or whatever. And often the best way to look is outward, and we don't always do that. So that's kind of what I would say. It's less to do with intentional copying and more just the social reality of the time that Christians were not immune to either.
I'd like to bring up the Erastus inscription real quick, and the reason why is because I know there's a problem in the claim, like it's not certain if it's the same Erastus mentioned in Romans 16.
Mm-hmm.
But if it were him, would it tell us a little bit? Actually, let me rephrase the question, regardless if it's him or not in the inscription. Does Erastus of Corinth at all, just the person being at Corinth, the treasure man, do you think that could tell us a little bit about the spread in Paul's day? That they're connected to wealthy people or people with a lot of connections like Erastus and so forth.
That's a good question. I'm not sure if I mean, as you know, I'm sure there's a lot of questions about whether there's the famous article by Stephen Friesen called "The Wrong Erastus." So he basically argues that this wasn't the same Erastus that Paul mentions. There's other questions about whether that section of Romans was added later. Maybe I did a video on this once, and I mentioned that this was just me speculating, but I said maybe the author of a later section of Romans knew that Erastus was somebody you should mention, and added that in as kind of Paul's, this imaginary epistolary network. The short answer is I don't know. It's conceivable to me from the comparables. It's conceivable to me that there could be, let me say this carefully, but from the comparable evidence I looked at, it's conceivable that there could have been quite high status people who worked as benefactors or who were engaged as benefactors for, say, Pauline Christ groups. I don't think that's completely out of thinking. And I think we get evidence of some people. I mean, who is Phoebe? We don't really know, but we have evidence of some kind of wealthy benefactors. Whether Erastus was one of them, I have no idea. I don't really even know how to evaluate that. It's a fascinating question, but yeah, I mean, it's not one that I really have a strong opinion of.
Does the evidence of redaction, addition, civil letters, letters being written in Paul's name later, do these things in a sense complicate attempts to evaluate the spread of Christianity in Paul's day due to his text being manipulated at a later time?
Yeah, I think they definitely do. If you're looking at texts that have been glossed over, and again, I know we're talking about Marcus Vincent's work a little bit here. If you're looking at texts that have been glossed over and adapted and kind of reworked to become canonical, yeah, I mean that it's questionable how much value they then are for historically reconstructing the first century movement. But with that, I think comes its own interesting questions too. So, for example, if I think about the God-fearers in Acts, for example, I could say I don't know what the God-fearers in Acts actually tells me about first century Christianity, but it does potentially tell me something about the author of Acts and how they imagine this movement spreading. And I think we've really focused a lot on God-fearers as being Gentiles, and that's kind of the way the story goes, is that this moves out to the God-fearers, and that's the way that we tell the story of Christianity often. But I think it's also worth asking the question of how come so many of them are wealthy Gentiles? Like, how come so many of them are? So is that a social reality, or does that tell us something about the author of Acts? Is the author of Acts in the 2nd century looking at these, maybe looking at the reality? Let's imagine I'm still thinking, I did an interview with Robin Faith Walsh, and she gave me this word she uses, but it's nouveau riche. Like, Christianity is like early Christianity among these like nouveau riche people who obviously have some money, and they're maybe not at the top of society, but they're educated and all these sorts of things. So is this maybe a way that the author of Acts wants to make Christianity, maybe wants to explain a social reality that there's that Christianity is no longer a religion of, could we say, like, I don't want to say peasants is not the right word, but that essentially Christianity is now operating at a higher class than it began? I don't know. It's possible. Could we say maybe that the author of Acts is speculating as to where sorry, I'm just lost my train of thought. Yeah, is it a social reality for the author of Acts, or is it maybe the author of Acts is using this common phenomenon of wealthy people connected to sanctuaries as a way to give more legitimacy to the story of the Christian movement? We certainly know one of the things, if you look at Acts, that Christianity is idealized almost as a philosophical movement, almost looks like something like the Therapeutae from Josephus or Philo. So yeah, I don't know, but I think rather than asking about first century Christianity, if we read our data right, it also gives us interesting questions about later Christianity and how they wanted to tell their own stories. Why did they want to include this stuff in the stories? I think that's equally interesting.
What do you make of the arguments that Steve Mason and others put forward in arguing that Acts knew Josephus? And if you think that Acts did know Josephus, do you think that Josephus's text influenced the way Acts portrayed Paul and the travel narratives of Paul, including how it portrayed the spread of Christianity?
I think he's right. I think Steve Mason is bulletproof on this one. Like, I really don't see how you can get around it. He's made. Have you had him on the channel? You've probably interviewed him, I take it. And actually, I've seen
Yes.
you interview him. Yeah. I actually interviewed him recently too. I don't have the interview out on my channel yet, but it'll be coming out soon. Yeah, he makes the case both for Luke and Acts, and I think they're both right. In Luke you get Quirinius and a few other things. In Acts, it's famously the speech by Gamaliel is a really quite the red herring, I think, for the fact that the author of Acts knows Josephus. So you have this famous thing where Gamaliel talks about Theudas, who's this rebel who hasn't actually lived by the time of Gamaliel. So he lived like 10 years after Gamaliel. But anyway, he talks about this uprising by Theudas, and then he talks about another uprising by Judas the Galilean. These are both kind of things that in this speech, Gamaliel, ostensibly Gamaliel, is talking about how if Christianity is just another one of these rebel movements, it'll die out, just like Theudas and Judas. But if it's real, if it's from God, it'll last. And the red herring there, as Stephen Mason argues really well, I think, is even though the order of Judas and Theudas is inverted, even though that order is backwards, it makes sense if you actually if you read Josephus, that those two things appear in that order in Josephus, because at one point, I hope I don't lose the viewers. I'll go quick and then people can look this up if they want. But at one point in Josephus, he talks about Theudas, and then he harkens back to Judas's sons. So in Josephus, if you just read it kind of sloppily, Judas comes after Theudas because of the way Josephus tells the story, even though they don't come after in time. The other famous thing is the Egyptian who leads people out into the desert that we see in Acts 2. So yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty bulletproof, and it's one of the things that makes me think about the God-fearers. So is Luke actually talking about God-fearers because he knows this social phenomenon, because he knows that synagogues have God-fearers around, or does he just know that there's supposed to be God-fearers because is he talking about Josephus? I don't know, but it could well be that he's just got that idea from Josephus, and later groups for that matter too. Who knows? In terms of sorry, what was the last part of the question? How that helps us with Christianity?
I think my last part of the question was, did it influence Acts' portrayal of Paul's travels and also the spread of Christianity?
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think about that, because I mean, you could go to like somebody like Dennis MacDonald too, or something, who's going to argue that it's influenced by
Homer.
By Homer. So yeah, I'm not sure. It's a good question. I don't really know the answer to that. Yeah.
There's another interesting thing about Josephus is there actually is another character. His name is very similar to Theudas. It's not quite the same. It's pretty close. It's Fudion. And Fudion, if I remember correctly, he was accused of trying to either assassinate or rebel against Herod the Great in I think it was around 7-6 BCE, somewhere around there, or maybe slightly earlier, and he was executed. So this would have been definitely before Judas the Galilean, and I've wondered if that also might have been on the mind of the author of Acts,
like getting them mixed up or something.
Yeah, I got the name mixed up with Theudas because it does sound a lot like it. So that's something that I've wondered.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah.
It would explain the chronology.
Yeah.
And so when you look at Acts, do you think that Acts knew the letters of Paul, or do you think it's independent? I know that there's a lot of different opinions about that. If there's a if there's direct contact?
It's really not my area of specialty. Like, as you can tell from my case studies, I focused a lot more on earlier things.
Well,
So I
well, the reason I asked was because in the context of the spread of Christianity.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, all I was going to say is that I rely on people smarter than me to tell me about that. So people like David Trobish and Marcus Vincent and some of these kinds of people. So, um, yeah, I don't know. I don't really have a good answer. I guess it would be a question of why the details don't always line up. There's a few things like that, but otherwise, yeah, I'm not sure.
So I'd like to ask you a bit more about the closed ethnic trust network. So this is going back to the Phoenicians on Delos.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
what could you expand there on what you see going on there and how that might be informative?
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah, so the Phoenicians on Delos are a really interesting case study. Unlike the Syrians, so the Syrians on Delos open up and they take other ethnicities. The Phoenician group seems to have remained really closed throughout its time. It seems to be a really tight knit group. So it seems to be primarily made up of people from Beirut. These people are called shippers. They are called warehouse workers. Although I wrote an article, I never published it, but I actually think these are more like a financial guarantor. So I had done some work in different kind of Aramaic inscription, some different Semitic languages, and argued that these are financial guarantors. But this is one of the other pieces of research sitting on my hard drive that's never been published. And what was I saying? Shippers, warehouse workers, or financiers, and like salespeople, I guess, merchants. So this like closed ethnic group of the Phoenicians, but it's really interesting because even though we think of them as a closed ethnic group, they don't really model a type of what we might call like an ethnic exclusivity, or I don't know. They don't model the type of kind of inverted focus that we would imagine, because they still use their worship to honor outsiders and to build relationships. So let me give you an example. Um, One of the interesting finds at this, there's a clubhouse, a big kind of building where these Phoenicians met, and in one of the sanctuaries there's a statue of the goddess Roma. So this Phoenician group that ostensibly meets because they're honoring Baal and they're training into Rome, they're doing, they're obviously training across the Mediterranean with Romans. They incorporate the goddess Roma into their worship, even though they are a closed ethnic group. So that's really interesting to me. Like, at the first place, that's like when we think about people um, adopting other gods, other deities, I don't know that that's something we would go to. And presumably, and we have to just kind of tell this story, but presumably this is because worshiping the goddess Roma was a good way of endearing themselves to the Romans, who presumably they were making a lot of money off of. But the other thing that we see is the same story. So coming back to this kind of wealthy benefactor story, these people as well have really, really wealthy benefactors. One of the earliest points that we see the Phoenicians on Delos is in an inscription where they honor this benefactor from Syria, who's like a kinsman or something, like at the same table as the Greek kind of says, he's really well known to one of the Seleucid kings. So that's kind of interesting. And later, this same guy would actually help kill that king. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, they have this like really, really strong connection to somebody like incredibly, incredibly influential on the other side of the Mediterranean. One of the most influential people here at the sanctuary. I should say, just as an aside, we don't know too much about it, but they also at one point honor the Roman Strategos as well. So like, they're really well connected to really powerful people on the island and across the Mediterranean. One of the most influential benefactors for the Phoenician clubhouse is a guy named Marcus Menatius. And Marcus apparently is also a banker. Did I get that right? Sorry, let me just think about the name for a minute. Marcus. Yeah, I think it's Marcus Menatius. Marcus is also a banker. And they tell this story about how they're building their clubhouse. They're building this clubhouse on Delos, and they run out of money. And Marcus steps up, essentially. This guy steps up. He gives them a loan at no interest. He forwards the money right away, so he gets it to them fast so they can keep building. And he gives them a 7,000 drachma gift to keep the work going. And this is an incredible amount of money. Like, this is a lot of money. So he gives them this gift to keep their clubhouse being built. So you have this like story again of a really wealthy, powerful person having these relationships with this Phoenician trading group and giving them a ton of money to build this sanctuary. What's really interesting is then they respond with all of these ritual sort of I almost want to use the word religious, but I'm not going to, but they respond with like these ritual actions to honor this person. So they're going to have a banquet in honor of him after the parade. They're going to set up all these different Thanksgiving types of places. So there'll be a statue outside. There's going to be a portrait inside. He gets the best seat in the house when he comes to visit. He can come have the best seat. So they preserve all these honors for him. They set up fines. So anybody who doesn't honor him in this way is subject to like some serious penalties that are so high. I think at one point it's like 5,000 or 6,000 drachma. Like, it's questionable who could even pay this, but maybe it's just symbolic. I don't know. Or maybe they're really rich, but there's this fine for anybody who doesn't do this. So it's really interesting. I mean, first of all, you do get what I've already talked about, these really wealthy, influential people, even in a group that is ostensibly a closed ethnic network, they're still building relationships outside. And coming back to what I said at the beginning, you really can't see lines between the religious and the economic. Like, they're just completely melded. There's somebody, one scholar wrote a book called The Sacred Bonds of Commerce on Delos. And I think that's the best way to summarize it. Like, these things are just completely intertwined. So when you have this really wealthy guy who's giving this much money to the sanctuary, and in turn, they are performing like ritual acts, essentially. They're rewriting their ritual calendar in some ways. They're having a bull sacrifice. I didn't say that. They have a bull sacrifice for him. They're doing all these things to honor him. We see this kind of interplay between what we could consider the religious and the economic. Like, the two are really intricately connected. So that's where it was really interesting to me, because I wondered if I would find groups that are a little more closed off, groups that are a little more secretive, and they certainly may have existed. But despite the fact that in terms of the membership in the Phoenician sanctuary on Delos, despite the fact that that membership at least seemed to remain primarily those people from Beirut, they still had connections to people outside. They still had connections to other incredibly wealthy, powerful connected people. So I think that was like one of the things I took away, especially from the two. It's true of the Athenian example as well, which we haven't talked about. We don't have to, but one of the things that I took away is, again, there's no separation between religion and economy. That essentially, if there's a sanctuary, it's got money flowing in and out. In Athens, these sanctuaries, and it's true on Delos too, but in Athens, these sanctuaries are counted as part of the city revenues, because it's so important. The money these sanctuaries makes is so important to the city revenues and the structures. Like, all the finance, Athenian finance relies on skin sales, things like this, sacrifices, things like that. So it was interesting to me to see just how closely connected that religious element was. So when I was thinking about like religion in the ancient world, I was looking for ethnic groups. Okay, some ethnic groups maybe go out and they grow and they become mixed ethnic sanctuaries, maybe like we imagine Christianity. Some of them retain like an ethnic core. And I found both of those types of groups, but both of them use religion to maintain relationships with outsiders. And that's a really interesting thing. And I don't even know completely how, if that leads us to questions about early Christianity, I'm not even completely sure what it is. But I definitely don't think we've spent enough time thinking about the economic networks that people like Paul may have moved in. Or we could say, to take a second century example, somebody like Marcion obviously is very well connected economically as well. So I think that's what that was one of the surprising things about the Phoenicians on Delos.
So now I want to ask you about Luke's narrative, specifically Luke repeating the phrase from Ezekiel, "His blood will be on his own head." You were talking about this in the context of the diaspora and invention of Christian origins, in Luke's narrative of the spread of Christianity into Corinth specifically.
Yeah, sorry, what's the question?
So my question is What is Luke trying to do when he talks about the spread of Christianity into Corinth while drawing from Ezekiel is in the Judean rejection of the message?
Mm.
What's going on there?
I'm not actually sure. It is an interesting story. You have, as I already said, you have the synagogue, and then it goes out to a God-fearer who lives next door. But you do eventually have, I think it's two, I believe, two of the synagogue leaders are eventually converted to Christianity in the narrative in Acts. So I'm not actually sure what that's doing. Maybe it's connected to something real historically. Maybe I'm just being too cynical. Like maybe there is something behind it. I'm not sure. I honestly just don't know how to assess it. It's yeah, I don't know if it's just lazy on my part that I'm like so skeptical of Luke that I don't really spend too much time thinking about it as like historical details. But yeah, I'm not actually sure.
So my final question, what did you conclude at the end of your thesis about the observations that can be made about diaspora religion?
Yeah, so a couple of like really big picture things. And again, the thing about my thesis is that it's there's nothing that proves anything about early Christianity doing comparable work like this. Like it absolutely doesn't prove anything. It just ideally creates some questions that we should ask and helps us to kind of think through some different things. So the one big picture thing was the God-fearers, which we've already talked about. Interesting to see how um, these kind of powerful, wealthy people appear to be connected to almost every sanctuary that I studied. It's just everywhere. Greek ergotism, it's a very well-known phenomenon, but it definitely that gave me a lot to think about in terms of the spread of Christianity that way. Also, I think I mentioned this already too, but the idea that these wealthy people connected to sanctuaries, benefactors, whatever, that the idea that a sanctuary would say to them, like, well, you have to be circumcised to be connected to us or something. It was just thinking through that in terms of like how wealthy and how connected some of these people on Delos were. And I'm not saying that every early Christian ecclesia had this level of connection. They probably didn't, to be honest. Like this is a unique case because these are incredibly wealthy people trading across the Mediterranean into Rome. But nevertheless, that it kind of gives me some pause to think about. Um, a couple of other things. One we haven't talked about, I found really interesting, is the way that as these sanctuaries go, and for each of my case studies, I could kind of trace them across a couple hundred years. Not every case, but across a long period of time. And it was interesting to see the way that the kind of home identity or the ethnic identity, if I could call it that, gets ritualized. So for example, on at the Syrian sanctuary on Delos, I already mentioned you have this like a candlestick as a namara. You have different cultic titles that seem to be carried over. So there's a Greek temple structure put on top. I mentioned the Athenians took over the temple, but even down through that time, it retained a certain element of kind of like there'd be Aramaic words that sneak in to the vocabulary. There would be some of the titles in the sanctuary don't really fit in a Greek context. There's one that there's this word in Greek, an archizakavos or something. I forget what it is, but I argued in my thesis that this is probably some kind of a treasure that's actually taken from a Marseillais context. So I think that was one thing too, was seeing that if I can call it ethnic identity, like there's sort of an ongoing ritualization of this ethnic identity in each of the sanctuaries I looked at. And that's something I think we see in Christianity too. Even as the relationship to Jewish origins evolved, there's still kind of ongoing certain things. Like even just you look at the Gospels, like why does Jesus say like Eli Eli lama sabachthani or whatever? Like you look at those kind of connections, like presumably the author could have written that in Greek, but instead chose to keep it in Aramaic. So these are um, things that kind of create a sense of authenticity, I guess, or things that create a kind of ritual connection to whatever that kind of perceived home identity is. One of the other things I'll mention just really quick, and then yeah, maybe there'll be more. I don't know, in the questions or something. But the other thing that I found really interesting is that constantly these immigrant groups are retelling the stories of their origins. And there's often, if I could call it like a spiritualization of the stories of their origins. So one of the things For example, with the cult of Bendis in Athens, I didn't talk about this, but it seems to come into Athens because of Athenian foreign policy and like needing to have a really good relationship with Thrace. So this Thracian goddess comes in, the Athenians worship her. But a couple centuries later, when they're telling the story of why the goddess came in, they talk about how it's the oracle wanted the goddess to come in and this sort of thing. So I find that often when you look at the storytelling around these groups, another group is, this isn't one of my case studies, but I actually did a video on this on my channel too. But at the sanctuary of Serapis on the island of Delos, this priest tells this really beautiful story, and it's inscribed there, so thankfully we have it, about how his grandfather brought the cult, or brought Serapis, brought the deity basically from Egypt and brought it to Delos and set up there. And then the deity told him in a dream that he didn't want to be in this rented room. He wanted a nice place. So he goes and he finds a place, but it's full of manure, and he cleans it up. And anyways, it's all the story of like this miraculous purchase of a cultic space. And most of the details of how this place gets purchased are pretty ordinary. But in the retelling, it becomes this like really spiritual thing about how the god wanted this to happen. So I think when I talk about religion and economy, and I talk about how all of these people, had these connections to wealthy and influential people, we might become cynical again with our modern sensibilities and say, well, these are just like opportunistic almost. Like these are just people trying to be nice to the Romans so they can trade with them or something. And they're just trying to, the economic side is what's important and the religious side is just fake or something. But that really it's not really the case at all. And again, these are problematic modern readings, but it was interesting to see how these stories, even of like ostensibly economic origins, but they get spiritualized, they get retold, they get, presumably this god from Egypt is coming to Delos for something to do with trade, probably. But no, it's like the grandfather brought the god and the god tells him to do things. And so it's neat to see how people retell and reimagine the stories of their origins. And if we think about Acts, coming back to that work, I think it's something very similar. It's a retelling, it's a reimagining of the stories of the origins. There might be something authentic there. But from what I can tell, and again, the evidence unfortunately is quite scant from other places, but from what I can tell, it doesn't seem to be all that unusual that there's always kind of a mythologizing of origins of these cults.
We got a super chat question from Solara Knight. Thank you for your super chat. Without the endorsement of Constantine the Great, Christianity would have pettered out?
I don't know. It's a tough call. It's kind of counter history stuff. Or would another stream of Christianity have won? I don't know. Yeah, I'm really not good at this counterfactual stuff. What else would we expect? Maybe like Manichaeanism or something. But yeah, I'm not sure. At any case, it's would it have petered out? Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know. It's possible. It's definitely possible. Yeah, I'm sorry. That's a lousy answer to a super chat. It's a great question. I don't really know. There's so many historical variables. It's really hard to know, what would have happened without that endorsement.
So I just want to remind everybody, we'll put the link to Chris's YouTube channel will be in the description below, and will also be in the pinned comment. And with that being said, Dr. Chris Cornthwaite, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.